Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Charles Martin has devastated Gerald Washington with a straight left hand to stop him inside 6 rounds on the co-main event of the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury pay-per-view event in Las Vegas. This was an interesting fight, and we'll get to some of the action. It was interesting in that the rounds were quite close, low volume, and I found it quite hard to score early on. Even though the international commentary team that I was listening to was talking like Charles Martin was pitching a shutout, I certainly didn't have it all for Charles Martin. It wasn't one of those sorts of fights. It was low volume, it was a bit ugly, but what Charles Martin was doing, he was actually landing the more eye-catching shots. And that might be only 1 or 2 times a round, but sometimes that was enough to win. And ultimately, Gerald Washington, the 37-year-old former title challenger, just wasn't moving his head. He was getting clipped with that straight left once or twice around. Sometimes that was enough for Martin to win the round, and you kind of got the impression that Martin was really going to tag him with it at some point. And ultimately, it came to pass in the 6th round. He lands a brutal straight left. Washington down like a sack of potatoes off a cliff. He gets up quite quickly. Tony Weeks, the referee, doesn't like what he sees, and it's all over. A 6th round stoppage for Charles Martin. And I'm not going to say it was like an impeccable performance and, something that Charles Martin can parade around as a world level win, because Gerald Washington and Charles Martin, there's a debate about where they really are in the heavyweight division right now. But Martin certainly proved that he's capable and potentially up for another world level fight, where I think Gerald Washington, this was a crossroads fight for him. He needed to win it to stay in the conversation for a proper contender level fight. Remembering this was an IBF eliminator, and I'll come to that shortly. But at 37 and Washington having this loss to Charles Martin, you'd have to ask where to next for Gerald Washington. Simply put, at a certain level, he just really can't go past it. He really is the sort of top 30 guy there or thereabouts. And at 37, even though the commentators were at pains to point out he's a young 37, whatever that means, I think, there will be some fights if he wants to continue for him, but in terms of his aspirations for a world title, I think he has done his dash. He's proven he cannot get to the top level and cannot get to a title shot again. That's just my views on that. So remains to be seen what Gerald Washington will do, but Charles Martin sitting pretty after that performance. He landed that straight left throughout the fight. It actually backed up Gerald Washington quite heavily, the end of round 1. And you could see in rounds 2 and 3, Washington was a bit tentative to engage, because early on in the fight, Washington was finding a home for his right hand, but he was actually outworking Martin to some extent by landing jabs, to the body mostly, some to the head and right hands. But this is why I say it was quite close, because, Washington I thought was actually landing more volume, but Charles Martin had those eye-catching shots that were backing up Gerald Washington and even hurting him at times. There was 1 or 2 times in the fight where Washington, you could clearly see that he was hurt. And then obviously in round 6, he was wrecked by that straight left again. Charles Martin advances with a win. So what next for Charles Martin? It's an interesting question, because he'll be pinning his hopes on the IBF now. And the situation as it stands at the moment is Kubrat Pulev is the IBF mandatory challenger. And this was not designated a final eliminator. And the commentary team seemed to be just talking this up and saying he was going to be the next mandatory. But, that's not necessarily the case, because the IBF actually could order Charles Martin into a final eliminator. And if they're going to do that, the highest ranked guy that he could face for that eliminator, currently as it stands, is Adam Kovnarski. And we've actually already seen that fight. That was back in 2018, Kovnarski winning it 96-94 on the cards. But that was a case where Martin was having a lot of success in the second half of the fight. And if it had been a 12-round fight, he might have got the win there. But Kovnarski kept his O intact, which he has to this day. He's actually fighting Robert Helenius in a couple of weeks, a guy that Gerald Washington knocked out last year. So these guys have been doing a bit of a merry-go-round. And potentially we may end up seeing a rematch between Kovnarski and Charles Martin. I think that is a likely possibility for the IBF. I don't think that they will make Charles Martin the mandatory after Pulev on the back of this lone win. Remembering, Charles Martin only came into the rankings a couple of months ago. He's number 11 at the moment. Gerald Washington was number 9. So how you could actually make a case that that could be for the mandatory after Pulev is beyond me. I'm sure they'll push for it, but I think what we'll see, if Kovnatski beats Helenius, then we'll have Charles Martin, Kovnatski too. That would be my pick. But a decent performance by Martin. Relatively sedate. He was, not necessarily trying to brawl with Washington. He was relying on his boxing more, but he was just picking his opportunities. Washington was zero head movement. It was always going to see a few shots land at some point. And Martin found the target, got the win, good win, and he moves on. Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.